Just 6 days after spending an afternoon gardening in his backyard, 42-year-old Walter Mack sat in an operating room while surgeons fought to save his right eye. Hours earlier, one specialist had quietly warned his wife that even emergency surgery might not be enough. The damage was spreading so quickly that, by the next morning, he could lose his vision forever. No one understood why. The first doctor called it a scratched cornea. The second diagnosed a routine eye infection. Antibiotic drops were supposed to stop it. Instead, the pain became unbearable. His vision grew dimmer by the hour. Then a strange white patch appeared in the center of his eye, and it kept getting bigger. Something was destroying his eye from the inside. The most terrifying part? Walter never suffered a major accident. Nothing pierced his eye. Nothing splashed into it. There was no dramatic injury anyone could remember. Just one small, unconscious habit that lasted less than 2 seconds. He rubbed his eyes after gardening. How could something millions of people do without thinking leave a healthy man on the verge of permanent blindness less than a week later? This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
For Walter Mack, gardening wasn't just a weekend chore, it was his escape. At 42 years old, he spent most of his weekdays working indoors, staring at screens and sitting through meetings. But every Saturday morning, he traded fluorescent lights for sunshine, gloves, and a shovel. He took pride in keeping his backyard looking perfect. Pulling weeds, trimming shrubs, spreading mulch, those quiet hours outside helped him clear his mind. That Saturday seemed no different. The weather was warm, and the soil was dry enough to kick up tiny clouds of dust every time he dug into the flower beds. He spent hours pulling stubborn weeds, pruning overgrown bushes, and hauling away piles of dead branches. By the afternoon, sweat dripped from his forehead, and bits of dirt clung to his face. At one point, his eyes began to itch. Without thinking, Walter wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his gardening glove, then rubbed both eyes to stop the irritation. It stung for only a second. He blinked a few times. His eyes watered briefly, then the discomfort disappeared. He finished working, packed away his tools, showered, and went on with the rest of his weekend. He had dinner with his wife, watched a movie that evening, and woke up the next morning feeling perfectly normal. Nothing about that moment seemed important. There was no sharp pain, no bleeding, no object stuck in his eye. No reason to believe that a tiny, invisible injury had just set something dangerous in motion. For the next 2 days, Walter went to work, drove his car, answered emails, and lived exactly as he always had. He had no idea that while he carried on with his normal life, a silent threat had already begun changing the surface of his eye. And when the first symptom finally appeared, it looked so harmless that almost anyone would have ignored it. What was the first sign that something was terribly wrong? Monday morning began like any other. Walter got dressed for work, poured himself a cup of coffee, and glanced in the bathroom mirror. His right eye was slightly red. He barely gave it a second thought. After spending an entire Saturday gardening, a little dust or pollen seemed like the obvious explanation. By mid-morning, his eye felt as though a grain of sand was trapped beneath his eyelid. He blinked constantly, hoping it would wash away. Instead, it became more irritating with every passing hour. His coworkers noticed him rubbing his eye. "Rough allergy season?" one of them joked. Walter smiled. "Probably." That answer made perfect sense. On the drive home, the afternoon sunlight suddenly felt painfully bright. He caught himself squinting at every traffic light and shielding his right eye whenever the sun broke through the windshield. That evening, he stopped at a pharmacy and picked up lubricating eye drops. The label promised fast relief. For a few minutes, they seemed to work. Then the burning returned. Before going to bed, Walter looked in the bathroom mirror one more time. He leaned closer. Near the center of his right eye was a tiny white speck. He blinked. It was still there. He assumed it was just a reflection from the bathroom light, splashed some water on his face, and went to sleep. By Tuesday morning, the white speck hadn't disappeared. It was larger. The redness had spread across nearly the entire white part of his eye. The gritty sensation had turned into real pain, and his vision looked strangely cloudy, as though he were trying to see through a fogged-up window. His wife stopped pouring her coffee the moment she looked at him. "Walter, your eye doesn't look right." For the first time, he felt a flicker of concern. Maybe it wasn't allergies after all. Maybe he'd scratched his cornea while gardening. Either way, an urgent care clinic should be able to fix it. What Walter couldn't see was that every hour he waited gave whatever was inside his eye more time to spread. Later that afternoon, a doctor examined his eye, took one look through the microscope, and confidently diagnosed a routine eye infection. It was the mistake that nearly cost Walter his sight. Why did the first doctor believe it was something so ordinary when something far more dangerous had already taken hold? While Walter was blaming dust, allergies, and a scratched cornea, a very different battle had already begun. Here is what was happening inside Walter's eye. When he rubbed his eye after gardening, he likely did more than wipe away sweat and dirt. Somewhere in that brief moment, the perfectly smooth surface of his cornea, the clear window covering the front of the eye, developed a microscopic injury. It was so small that Walter never felt it. He couldn't see it in the mirror, but it was enough. That tiny break in the cornea became an open doorway. Something from the environment slipped through that invisible opening and settled into the damaged tissue. Hidden beneath the surface, it remained protected where normal defenses struggled to reach it. At first, Walter's immune system responded the way it always does. Specialized cells rushed toward the injury, trying to contain whatever had entered his eye. Tiny blood vessels around the cornea became inflamed, causing the redness he first noticed in the bathroom mirror. Fluid collected around the injured tissue, creating the gritty sensation that felt as though sand were trapped beneath his eyelid. But this time, the normal defenses weren't working. Instead of disappearing, the invading organism continued moving deeper into the cornea. As it spread, the once clear tissue that focused light onto Walter's retina slowly began losing its transparency. Healthy corneal cells became damaged. The smooth surface became uneven. Light entering his eye scattered in every direction instead of forming a sharp image. That was why bright sunlight suddenly became painful. That was why road signs looked slightly blurry. That was why the tiny white spot in his eye kept growing. To Walter, it looked like irritation. To the doctors, it would soon resemble a routine infection. In reality, something far more dangerous was quietly establishing itself inside one of the most delicate tissues in the human body. And with every passing hour, treating it the wrong way would make stopping it even more difficult. Why did the first treatment seem to help at first, only to leave Walter's eye in even greater danger? By Tuesday afternoon, Walter was sitting in an urgent care examination room with his right eye half closed. The doctor listened carefully as Walter described what had happened. A weekend spent gardening, an itchy eye, a little redness, then blurred vision. The examination didn't take long. Using a bright light and a magnifying lens, the doctor carefully inspected the front of Walter's eye. He noticed the redness, the irritation, and the small white spot that had begun forming on the cornea. None of it seemed unusual. "You've probably scratched your cornea," the doctor explained. "It happens all the time." Walter felt a wave of relief. A scratched cornea sounded painful, but it also sounded temporary. The doctor prescribed antibiotic eye drops to prevent infection and advised Walter to use them exactly as directed. He assured him the irritation should begin improving within the next day or two. Walter thanked him, picked up the prescription, and drove home believing the worst was already behind him. That evening, he placed the bottle beside the bathroom sink and carefully squeezed the first drops into his eye. For the first few minutes, the burning eased. He smiled. Maybe the doctor had been right. Maybe all he needed was a little time. But before the evening was over, the pain returned, stronger than before. By the next morning, Walter woke with his right eyelid stuck shut. When he finally managed to open it, his vision had become noticeably worse. The white spot had grown. Even ordinary light pouring through the bedroom window felt like someone was shining a flashlight directly into his eye. He reached for the antibiotic drops again. They weren't helping anymore. In fact, with every passing hour, his eye seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Walter still believed he was treating the right problem. He had no way of knowing that the real danger had never responded to those drops in the first place. As the days passed, the damage accelerated, and soon, even the doctors would realize they were facing something they hadn't expected. What did the eye specialist see that made him immediately abandon the original diagnosis? By Thursday morning, Walter knew something had changed. When he opened his right eye, he could barely make out the numbers on his alarm clock. The world hadn't gone completely dark, but it wasn't clear anymore. The vision in his right eye looked as though he were staring through frosted glass. Shapes were still there, but the details had disappeared. Even worse, the pain had become relentless. Every blink felt as though sandpaper were scraping across the surface of his eye. Bright light was unbearable. He found himself keeping the curtains closed and wearing sunglasses inside his own home just to make the pain tolerable. His wife didn't argue this time. She picked up the phone and scheduled the earliest appointment she could find with an eye specialist. Walter arrived later that morning, expecting nothing more than a stronger prescription. Instead, the appointment grew unusually quiet. The ophthalmologist listened carefully as Walter described the last few days: gardening over the weekend, the redness, the burning, the white spot, and the antibiotic drops that seemed to make no difference. Then the specialist rolled a slit lamp into position. "Rest your chin here," he said. Walter stared straight ahead as an intense beam of light swept across the front of his eye. The doctor didn't speak. He leaned in closer, adjusted the microscope, looked again. Several long seconds passed. Then he quietly asked a question no one else had thought to ask. "What exactly were you doing before this started?" "Gardening," Walter answered. "I was pulling weeds and trimming bushes." The doctor's expression changed. For the first time all week, someone wasn't looking only at Walter's eye. They were looking for a cause. The specialist performed another examination, this time adding a fluorescent dye that highlighted the damaged areas of Walter's cornea. The glowing pattern wasn't what he had expected to see. He stepped back. His confidence disappeared. "This isn't behaving like a routine eye infection," he said quietly. Walter felt his stomach tighten. "If it's not an infection," he asked, "then what is it?" The doctor didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. What he did know was far more frightening. If they didn't identify the real cause soon, Walter might lose his vision before they had another chance to stop it. What did the specialist order next that would finally reveal what had been hiding inside Walter's eye all along? The ophthalmologist didn't waste another minute. "We need to take a sample from your eye," he said. Walter looked at him, confused. "A sample?" The doctor nodded. "I don't want to guess anymore." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Walter realized the specialists no longer believed they were dealing with a routine case. Within minutes, numbing drops were placed into his eye. Under the bright beam of the slit lamp, the ophthalmologist carefully positioned a tiny sterile instrument against the cloudy white area on Walter's cornea. "You'll feel a little pressure," he said. Walter held perfectly still. Using delicate movements, the doctor gently collected a small scraping from the surface of the damaged tissue. The sample was immediately placed onto glass slides and into sterile containers before being rushed to the hospital laboratory. Now they had to wait. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Walter was admitted to the hospital that afternoon, so specialists could monitor his eye around the clock. Every few hours, nurses returned to check his vision. "Can you read the top line?" Sometimes he could. A few hours later, he couldn't. The white spot continued spreading across the front of his eye. His vision continued fading. The pain medication dulled the ache, but it couldn't stop whatever was happening beneath the surface. Late that evening, the ophthalmologist returned to Walter's room. He wasn't carrying good news. "The laboratory has already examined the first slides," he said. Walter searched the doctor's face. "What did they find?" The doctor paused. "They found something. But we need more testing before we can say exactly what it is." Walter's heart sank. For days, every doctor had been certain they knew the answer. Now the specialists were admitting they didn't. More samples were sent for advanced testing. Every hour mattered. Whatever was damaging Walter's eye wasn't slowing down, and the team knew that choosing the wrong treatment now could cost him the vision they were still trying to save. Outside Walter's hospital room, the ophthalmologist picked up the phone and called an infectious disease specialist. It was a consultation he rarely needed. What did the infectious disease team recognize that everyone else had missed from the very beginning? Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. If you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Even if you've clicked it before, you can click it again on every new video you watch from this channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Now, let's continue. By Friday morning, nearly a week had passed since Walter had spent the afternoon gardening. His right eye had deteriorated dramatically. He could no longer recognize faces clearly on that side. Bright light forced him to keep the blinds closed, and the white patch on the front of his eye had grown larger overnight. The laboratory was still running additional tests. Time was running out. That morning, another specialist joined the ophthalmology team to review Walter's case. Instead of studying the laboratory reports first, he pulled up a chair beside Walter's hospital bed. "Start from the beginning," he said. Walter closed his eyes and replayed the last week in his mind. The backyard, the weeds, the dust, the sweat running into his eyes. Then he stopped. "I forgot something," Walter said quietly. Everyone in the room looked at him. "My eyes started itching while I was working." He hesitated. "I rubbed them with my gardening glove." The room fell silent. The specialist turned toward the ophthalmologist. "Did you find any damage to the cornea?" "A microscopic scratch," the ophthalmologist replied. "Small enough that he never would have noticed it." No one spoke for several seconds. For the first time, the timeline finally made sense. The scratch explained how something could have entered the eye. The gardening explained where it may have come from. The worsening vision explained that whatever had started this process was still active, but one question remained unanswered. What was it? Walter looked from one doctor to the next. "So what's happening to me?" The specialist answered honestly. "We're not ready to say yet." It wasn't the answer Walter wanted, but it was the truth. For days, everyone had been confident. Now, no one was. The team reviewed the scans again. They studied photographs of Walter's cornea, taken only 24 hours apart. The difference was unmistakable. The damaged area had expanded. Whatever was causing it wasn't slowing down. It was winning. The doctors gathered outside Walter's room. If they waited for every laboratory result, they might lose the chance to save his vision. If they guessed wrong again, they could make an already devastating injury even worse. For the first time, Walter's future depended on a decision the doctors had to make before they had all the answers. Would they risk starting a treatment for a disease they still couldn't name, or wait for proof and risk Walter losing his sight forever? Late Friday afternoon, the laboratory finally called. The ophthalmologist answered the phone, listened for several seconds, and thanked the technician before quietly hanging up. The room fell silent. The final test had confirmed what the medical team had begun to suspect. Walter wasn't dealing with a routine eye infection. He had developed fungal keratitis, a rare but potentially devastating infection of the cornea, caused by microscopic fungi that can enter the eye after even the smallest injury. For Walter, everything traced back to one ordinary moment. While gardening, tiny particles from soil or plant material had likely contaminated his glove. When he rubbed his itchy eye, a microscopic scratch on the surface of his cornea gave the fungus an opportunity to enter tissue that should have remained sealed from the outside world. The fungus didn't spread like a cut on the skin. Instead, it slowly grew through the layers of the cornea itself. As it advanced, it triggered inflammation, damaged healthy corneal cells, and left behind the growing white patch the doctors had been watching with increasing concern. That was why Walter's vision had become cloudy. Light could no longer pass cleanly through the once transparent cornea. Instead, it scattered in every direction before reaching the retina, making the world appear blurred and hazy. It also explained why the antibiotic drops had failed. Antibiotics are designed to kill bacteria. Fungi are completely different organisms. The medication Walter had faithfully used for days had never been capable of stopping what was actually growing inside his eye. By the time the laboratory confirmed the diagnosis, nearly a week had already passed. The fungus had gained a dangerous head start. The ophthalmologist returned to Walter's hospital room, carrying the laboratory report. Walter looked up immediately. "You know what it is?" The doctor nodded. "We do." Walter took a deep breath. "Can you fix it?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up a chair beside the bed. "There are treatments," he said carefully. But fungal infections of the cornea can be extremely difficult to eliminate. Even with the correct medication, some patients continue to lose vision because the damage has already been done. Walter lowered his eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, he finally knew the name of the enemy. But knowing its name didn't mean the battle was over. In many ways, the hardest part was only just beginning. Could the strongest medications available stop the fungus before Walter lost his sight forever? The diagnosis finally gave the doctors a target. It did not give them a guarantee. Within hours of receiving the laboratory report, Walter's treatment changed completely. The antibiotic drops were stopped. In their place, the ophthalmology team began powerful antifungal eye drops designed to attack the organism growing inside his cornea. Unlike routine eye medications, these drops had to be given almost constantly. Even through the night, nurses entered Walter's room hour after hour, waking him to place another drop into his injured eye. Sleep became almost impossible. So did the pain. Every dose represented another chance to stop the infection before it penetrated even deeper into the cornea. But fungal keratitis is one of the most challenging eye infections to treat because the organisms can invade layers of tissue that medications struggle to reach. The doctors watched Walter closely. Each morning, they photographed his cornea. Each afternoon, they compared the new images with the ones from the day before. Everyone searched for the same sign. Had the white patch stopped growing? The first day, no. The second day, still no. The damaged area appeared unchanged. No one could tell whether the medication simply needed more time or whether the fungus was continuing to spread despite everything they were doing. Walter could see the uncertainty on the doctors' faces. "Am I going to lose my eye?" he finally asked. The ophthalmologist didn't rush his answer. "Our goal is to save both your eye and your vision," he said, "but right now, I can't promise either." It was the hardest conversation Walter had ever heard. He had walked into an urgent care clinic expecting a few days of eye drops. Now he was being told there was a real possibility he might never see normally again. The medical team met repeatedly to discuss his case. If the antifungal medication finally began working, Walter might avoid surgery. But if the infection continued advancing, they would have no choice but to remove the damaged tissue before the fungus spread even farther. Every examination ended with the same uneasy question. Was the treatment finally turning the tide, or were they already running out of time? 3 days passed. Walter never missed a single dose of medication. Every hour, day and night, nurses continued placing antifungal drops into his eye. The medical team compared new photographs with the ones taken the day before, hoping to see even the smallest sign that the infection had stopped spreading. Instead, they saw something they had feared. The white patch had grown again. The infection was still advancing. That afternoon, the ophthalmologist gathered the rest of the team outside Walter's room. The medications were reaching the infection, just not fast enough. If we wait any longer, one surgeon said, he may lose the entire cornea. There was only one realistic option left: surgery. When the ophthalmologist explained the situation, Walter sat silently for several moments. "You mean, you're operating on my eye?" The doctor nodded. "The infection has damaged too much of the cornea. We need to remove the diseased tissue before it spreads any farther. Then we'll replace it with healthy donor tissue." Walter had never imagined he would need an eye operation because of a weekend spent gardening. Yet less than 2 weeks earlier, he had been pulling weeds without a second thought. Now he was signing consent forms that could determine whether he would ever see clearly again. Early the next morning, Walter was wheeled into the operating room. Bright surgical lights hung overhead. The room was unusually quiet. Everyone understood what was at stake. Using an operating microscope, the surgeon carefully removed the damaged portion of Walter's cornea, taking extreme care to remove as much infected tissue as possible while preserving the healthy structures beneath it. Moments later, a clear donor cornea was precisely stitched into place using threads so fine it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. The operation lasted just over an hour. Now came the hardest part: waiting to see whether every trace of the infection had been removed, because if even a small amount remained, it could begin growing all over again. When Walter woke in the recovery room, his eye was covered with a protective shield. He instinctively reached toward it. "Did it work?" he whispered. The surgeon smiled gently. The surgery went as planned. Walter let out a slow breath. It was the first hopeful news he had received in days. But everyone in the room knew the same thing. A successful operation didn't guarantee a successful recovery. Would the infection return, or had the doctors finally stopped it before it claimed Walter's sight? The first 24 hours after surgery were the longest of Walter's life. His right eye remained covered by a protective shield. He couldn't see the results. He could only wait. Each morning, the ophthalmologist carefully examined the transplanted cornea under the slit lamp, searching for one critical sign. Was the infection gone? For several days, no one could answer with complete certainty. Walter continued receiving antifungal medication while the surgical team monitored the new cornea for any evidence that the infection had returned. Every examination carried the same tension. The doctors leaned closer, adjusted the microscope, compared new photographs with those taken the day before. Slowly, something changed. The white area stopped expanding. The inflammation began to settle. For the first time since Walter had arrived at the hospital, the photographs finally looked better instead of worse. The treatment was working. When the ophthalmologist entered Walter's room that afternoon, he was smiling before he even spoke. "I think we've turned the corner." Walter closed his eyes in relief. Those were the words he had been waiting to hear. Over the following weeks, the transplanted cornea continued healing. The stitches held firmly in place. The infection never returned. Walter's vision improved little by little. Not overnight, not all at once. Every follow-up appointment brought another small victory. A few more letters on the eye chart, sharper outlines, brighter colors. Months later, Walter walked into the clinic for one of his final follow-up visits. The ophthalmologist handed him the eye chart. "Whenever you're ready." Walter covered his healthy eye. He began reading. The first line, then the second, then another. He smiled. For the first time since this ordeal began, he could see clearly enough to read without stopping. His eyesight wasn't exactly the same as it had been before. But he still had his vision. Considering how close he had come to losing it forever, that felt nothing short of extraordinary. Before Walter left, the ophthalmologist shared one final thought. "Most people think gardening is one of the safest hobbies imaginable," he said. "In almost every case, it is. But even a tiny eye injury deserves immediate attention, especially when soil or plant material is involved. Acting early can be the difference between a simple recovery and permanent vision loss." Walter nodded. He would never look at a pair of gardening gloves the same way again. But one question still lingered. How can something as ordinary as gardening become so dangerous? And what simple precautions could prevent the same thing from happening to someone else? Walter still enjoys gardening. The flowers still bloom every spring. The weeds still find their way back. And every now and then, he still spends an afternoon digging in the soil with dirt covering his gloves. But one habit changed forever. Now, before he wipes sweat from his face or rubs an itchy eye, he removes his gloves first. It takes only a few seconds. Those few seconds may have saved him from living the rest of his life in darkness. Walter's story isn't frightening because gardening is dangerous. Millions of people work in their gardens every year without suffering anything more serious than a sore back or a few dirty fingernails. What made Walter's case so unusual was an unfortunate chain of events. A microscopic scratch, contaminated plant or soil material, a brief moment of rubbing his eye, a rare fungal infection that silently took advantage of an opening no one knew existed. On their own, each step seemed harmless. Together, they nearly cost Walter his sight. Eye specialists say that any eye injury involving soil, plants, tree branches, or gardening equipment deserves immediate medical attention, especially if pain, redness, blurred vision, or increasing sensitivity to light develops afterward. Early evaluation can make a critical difference because some infections become much harder to treat once they penetrate deeper into the cornea. Walter was fortunate. The correct diagnosis came before it was too late. Aggressive treatment, skilled surgeons, and weeks of careful follow-up preserved enough of his vision for him to return to the life he loved. Not everyone is as lucky. Sometimes the most devastating medical emergencies don't begin with dramatic accidents. Sometimes they begin with ordinary moments so small they're forgotten almost immediately. A quick rub of the eye, a tiny scratch, a pair of dirty gardening gloves. And that's what makes stories like Walter's so unforgettable. Because the most dangerous mistakes are often the ones that feel too ordinary to matter. The next time you're working in your garden and your eye starts to itch, will you remember Walter Mack's story before you rub it? If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos. Even if you've clicked it before, you can click on it again on every new video you watch from this channel. Every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. And it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next diagnosis. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens?